The summer began like any other. The long days of warmth and nights that promised only the familiar hum of crickets. But somewhere beneath the laughter of children and the hum of cicadas, darkness had been waiting, quiet and patient, ready to claim its share of the living. By the time July rolled in, 5 people would come face to face with things they could never explain. Encounters that would leave their souls trembling long after the sun rose. First story began in the dense woods of Black Pine Forest, where the trees had stood for centuries, their branches thick enough to blot out the sunlight even at noon. A group of friends, seeking escape from the suffocating city heat, pitched their tents under the looming canopy. The night was calm at first, filled with the crackle of firewood and the occasional hoot of an owl. But soon the ordinary sounds of the forest became distorted. Twigs snapped in rhythms that didn't match the casual wandering of wildlife. Shadows moved against the grain of the wind, and whispers, low and guttural, threaded through the trees, calling the names of the campers. Sarah, the youngest, insisted she saw eyes gleaming from the darkness, too high above to be any human. She trembled as she called to her friends, but laughter echoed back, dismissive and sharp. They thought she was joking, not realizing that the eyes watching them were not playful. They were hungry. By midnight, the circle of firelight could no longer keep the forest at bay. The whispers grew louder, forming syllables that seemed almost recognizable, repeating the names of each camper in turn. Panic settled like a fog over the group. Jake, the bravest among them, went to investigate a sound near the tree line and never returned. His friends called his name until their voices hoarse, but only silence answered. When dawn broke, there were no footprints leading away from the fire, no sign of struggle. Only the heavy, oppressive quiet of a forest that had taken one of them entirely. Sarah and the others fled without looking back. Yet even hours later, when the city lights appeared on the horizon, she swore she could still hear whispers threading through the wind, promising that the forest had not finished its work. The second story came from the still waters of Mirror Lake, a place locals avoided during the high heat of summer despite its sparkling beauty. Alex and his brother were thrill seekers drawn by the eerie reputation of the lake. One afternoon, they rowed out into the glassy water, laughing at the warnings etched into old signage by previous visitors. But as they moved farther from the shore, a strange calm settled over the lake, thick and unnatural. The air felt heavier, the sun's reflection on the surface distorted, twisting shapes into patterns that were almost human. Ripples emerged in the water against the breeze, forming circles that pulsed like a heartbeat. Alex pointed it out to his brother, who dismissed it, teasing him about summer paranoia. But the lake had already begun to act. His brother's foot was yanked underwater, and Alex could only watch in horror as he disappeared beneath the glassy surface. The water churned, dark shapes writhing beneath, something neither fully solid nor liquid. Alex screamed, attempting to grab hold, but was thrown back by a force that was both immense and deliberate. The lake had claimed him too, pulling him close to its dark heart, forcing him to stare into reflections that were not his own. When he was rescued hours later, Alex muttered incoherently about faces beneath the surface, mouths open in silent screams, eyes that glimmered with hunger. Locals said the lake claimed another soul every summer, but no one knew why, and no one wanted to find out. By mid-July, the heat drew crowds to the coast, where tourists lined the beaches, unprepared for the sinister force lurking beneath the waves. Marie had decided to take her niece to a quiet inlet, a place with jagged cliffs and hidden tide pools. The sound of the waves masked the approaching terror. As they explored the rock formations, her niece wandered too close to a crevice partially submerged by the tide. Something cold and slimy brushed against her ankle, dragging her down into the water. Marie screamed and grabbed at her, but the current twisted unnaturally, pulling them both under. In the brief moments underwater, Marie saw shadows fled across the rocks above. Figures shaped vaguely like humans, but stretched and distorted, their mouths open in silent wails. When she finally broke the surface, gasping and coughing, her niece was gone. She clung to the jagged rocks, trembling, knowing that whatever lived in the inlet had claimed its prize for the summer. In a small suburban town farther inland, family's summer road trip became a nightmare that would haunt them for years. While driving late one evening on an empty stretch of highway, their headlights caught a figure standing on the edge of the road. It appeared to be a hitchhiker, thin and soaked, waving desperately. The father, trying to be helpful, stopped the car, rolling down the window. The figure clung climbed in silently, shaking, their eyes hollow, unfathomable. As they drove, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. Coldness pressed against the windows, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and every radio station played static until a low, guttural whisper filled the cabin, repeating the names of the passengers. Terrified, they tried to speak, but the figure only stared, unblinking, until they vanished. When the father looked in the rearview mirror, the seat was empty, but a wet footprint remained on the floor, slowly spreading across the carpet as if the car itself had absorbed the presence. The family never returned to that highway, but every car trip since brought a fleeting sense of eyes on them, waiting in the dark. Finally, there was the abandoned amusement park, cordoned off years ago after a series of unexplained accidents. Teenagers eager for thrills decided to explore despite the warnings. The Ferris wheel creaked in the wind, though no one had touched it for decades. As they wandered through the empty stalls, a distant laugh echoed hollow and wrong. Shadows moved against the light of their flashlights, stretching impossibly, always just beyond reach. One by one, they began to disappear, vanishing into the dark corridors of the park. Those who remained swore that the rides themselves shifted as if alive, blocking exits and guiding them towards something unseen. By morning, only one of the group stumbled out, eyes wide, whispering about laughter that followed, music that played itself, an amusement park that refused to stay abandoned. Summer came and went, but for those who experienced these horrors, the memories lingered. Each story, seemingly separate, shared a common thread, an unseen presence, an unnatural force that thrived in the heat and stillness of summer. The sun rose, the cicadas sang, and the world continued unaware. But the scars on the survivors were permanent. 5 encounters, each terrifying, each true, and all in a summer that would never be forgotten. The air had grown heavier as summer stretched on, the sun lingering lazily above streets and forests that had already witnessed unspeakable horrors. For those still untouched by the dark, the days seemed ordinary, but nightfall carried whispers that only the unlucky could hear. The second wave of terror this summer came swiftly, catching its victims unaware, preying on curiosity, and feeding on fear. It began in an isolated cabin near the edge of Crescent Lake, a place shrouded in legends that locals refused to speak aloud. A young couple, Mark and Eliza, had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, drawn by the promise of quiet, starry nights and the soothing lapping of the water. First evening was serene, the kind of peace that lulled people into forgetting mornings. But as darkness settled, a strange reflection appeared on the surface of the lake. It wasn't their own. The images flickered, warped, showing distorted faces that grinned and whispered in a language they couldn't understand. Eliza pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block the whispers, but the sound seeped through, vibrating into her bones. Mark, skeptical at first, went to investigate, walking toward the edge of the dock. The mist seemed thicker, curling like living fingers around his legs. The water stirred violently, rising higher than it should, yet no wind or waves caused it. Then, without warning, the surface broke. Faces pressed against it from below, mouths opening in silent screams. One hand shot out, dragging Mark beneath the water. Eliza screamed, clawing at him, but the lake claimed him. When the authorities arrived the next morning, she was the only one left, eyes wide, muttering about the faces that still followed her home, farther north, in a forgotten stretch of highway surrounded by dense pine forests. Another horror awaited travelers daring enough to drive after sunset. Jason, a delivery driver on a long route, had been warned about the stretch by a fellow trucker who spoke of the hitchhiker that no one could explain. Jason laughed it off, thinking it a local superstition. But that night, as his headlights cut through the blackness, he saw her, a young woman soaked in pale, standing perfectly still in the center of the road. He swerved to avoid hitting her, but she climbed into the cab without a word. Her presence wasn't warm, friendly, or human. It was cold, like a vacuum of life, sucking the air from the cab. The radio crackled and hissed until only her whispers filled the space. She recited every secret Jason had never spoken aloud, memories that belonged only to him. The wheel jerked violently as if the truck were alive, guiding him off the road and toward the trees. Jason blacked out. When he awoke, he was alone. The truck still on the pavement, tires intact, but every road sign ahead bore the same warning in letters carved deep into the wood. Turn back before you join her in the heart of the city. A different kind of terror waited in a place that should have been safe. An apartment building where the residents had begun noticing strange phenomena. Flickering lights, footsteps echoing down empty corridors, doors opening on their own. Anna, a new tenant, moved into the top floor, drawn by the view of the skyline at dusk. On her first night, she heard the elevator ding even though no one had called it. Peering out, she saw shadows moving against the glass doors. The shadows were not simple silhouettes. They were twisted shapes with limbs that bent in impossible ways. Faces that warped and shifted as if alive. They whispered her name, repeated it until her ears rang. When she tried to flee down the stairs, the building itself seemed to stretch, hallways lengthening, stairs ascending into darkness. By dawn, Anna's screams had faded, replaced by silence, and her apartment remained locked. Neighbors reported seeing flickers of her figure in the window, standing, staring silently at the street below, until she vanished entirely without a trace. The next story unfolded at the edge of a small carnival that had recently set up near a quiet suburb. Local children whispered about the clown who didn't belong, a figure that watched from the shadows, appearing only when no one looked directly at him. When Liam, a curious teenager, sneaked behind the stalls one evening, he found the clown sitting perfectly still, holding a balloon in each hand. Its painted smile seemed to stretch further with every blink. The clown spoke in a voice that was both familiar and alien, recounting events from Liam's childhood that no one else could know. The moment Liam tried to run, the carnival itself shifted. Stalls moved impossibly, pots looped back on themselves, and the rides operated without power. The clown's laughter followed him, echoing through the empty fairgrounds. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time itself felt distorted. When Liam finally emerged near the entrance, the fair was gone, replaced by an empty field under a crimson sunset. Yet the balloon strings remained tied to his wrist, and the painted smile haunted him every night thereafter. Finally, the fifth encounter of this summer revealed itself on the outskirts of an abandoned hospital, its crumbling facade hiding decades of forgotten tragedies. Sarah, an amateur photographer, had ventured inside to capture eerie images for her blog. The air was thick with decay, the scent of rusted metal and old medicine suffocating. As she moved through the hallways, she noticed handprints appearing on walls she hadn't touched, dripping with an inky black substance that vanished as soon as she turned to look directly at it. Footsteps echoed behind her, soft and slow, yet she was alone. Whispers came from the walls themselves, murmuring about accidents, surgeries, and lives ended too soon. Every corner she turned revealed shadowy figures, faces that weren't fully formed, yet recognized her presence following her silently. By the time she reached the main stairwell, the building seemed alive, breathing, watching. She barely escaped, running into the street as dawn broke, only to find her camera missing. The photos developed themselves later, revealing figures standing behind her in every shot, smiling silently, waiting that summer that year ended quietly for the world outside. But for the survivors, it was anything but calm. Each story carried its own horror, yet all were connected by the same invisible thread. Force awakened in the heat, thriving in darkness and feeding on fear. Those who lived through the events could not forget, and those who didn't simply disappeared, leaving only whispers, shadows, and memories that refused to die. Summer had come, scorching and relentless, but it left behind something colder, presence that lingered long after the sun had set.